Two large yellow letters IN with blue broken up letters spelling visible underneath make up the logo invisible.
The following is the full interview with Avril Coelho recorded during the filming of the documentary Invisible in April 2022, funded by the British Academy. Directed by Dr. Anica Zeyen and Wadeby. Interview conducted by Dr. Anica Zeyen. The writing disappears and we meet Avril. Avril is a woman of color with black hair. She wears a red and black top and sits in a community centre.
My name's Avril. I'm a councillor for Hampton North Ward, which is where we are now, in the White House Community Centre. I was elected in 2018. I'm also an accredited White Ribbon Champion, and I'm serving my third term on the Safer Neighbourhood Board representing business. I'm currently an independent councillor. I work in retail management for a company which helps people with their health and well-being. And I live alone. And I love what I do. I love helping people, giving them the right advice to sort their problems out. White Ribbon UK started over 30 years ago, and it's a global campaign. White Ribbon UK is the UK branch of it, and it tackles gender-based violence against women and girls. And people can commit to making the White Ribbon Promise on the White Ribbon website, and that commitment means that they won't look the other way and they won't tolerate any violence towards women when they see it, and they'll call it out.
Please tell us about your disability.
I've got a really rare condition recognised by NORD called Parry-Romberg syndrome. It's also known as Parry-Romberg's disease, but you can't catch it off me, so don't worry. And it's got three main symptoms, one of which is a recognised disability in itself, which is epilepsy. I've also got three worn vertebrae in my spine, which causes chronic pain in those areas. And I've also got muscle spasms in my jaw, so I have to have that paralysed every 3 to 5 months with injections in my temporalis, which is sort of up here, and a masseter here. And it's my epilepsy consultant that does that. And thankfully I only have to go to one hospital now for that, because the hospital that I used to see him for my epilepsy has now got that in their budget, so I don't have to go to 2 different hospitals for it.
How did your diagnosis make you feel?
It was a bit like something out of Harry Potter. So I don't know if you can imagine these really old leather-bound books that you used to get, and in these big old libraries. So my consultant, who is a kind of old school consultant called Peter Banks at the Queen Victoria Hospital in East Grinstead, which was a specialist burns unit during the war, he spent 2 years looking into finding out what was up with me and why one side of my face had stopped growing and the other side was still growing, and why the tissue was disappearing into nowhere. And one day he came out with this great big book at my appointment to show me and my parents. I was 11 at the time, and it was probably about A2 in size, if I were to describe it, and about 3 inches thick, maybe 4. He patted it and a big cloud of dust came out from it. So it really was like one of those old books that have been gathering dust a long time in the library. And he showed us the page that he found it in, and that was old school research, because these days everyone looks online for everything, but he had to do it the old-fashioned way. So that's how old I was when I found out. How did I feel about it? Confused, anxious, not knowing what it meant for me, not knowing if there was a cure, not knowing how they would try and treat it, and if they'd ever find a solution.
And what do you think is something that most people find or misunderstand about your disability, about your special condition?
I think a lot of people don't realise what it's like to grow up with a facial disfigurement or visible difference. That's why I like things like the Changing Faces campaign. People don't understand the stigma associated with any kind of disability or difference that's visible to the average person. Certainly when I was growing up, it was school photos. I hated school photos. And Yeah, my parents used to put them on the staircase next to my brothers and sisters, and walking past that every day, I didn't at first want to accept that my face had started changing, and my parents had said that it had, and they noticed over a couple of months since my first seizure. And I gradually had to accept that it had, and that's why I looked different in the photos. And I didn't know how to wear makeup. I grew up in a strict Catholic family and I wasn't allowed magazines, so to not know how to mask it or hide it. And one of the first operations I had, my mum went and got me some makeup from the chemist, and she said foundation may cover the bruising from the surgery you've had. And of course my skin was so thin at that side of my face that it wouldn't absorb in. So that's when I realised that I wouldn't be able to wear makeup like other girls either. People don't always make reasonable adjustments when you've got a disability, and they don't consider how your disability may make you feel emotionally. It took me an awful lot to get used to having my photo taken, and what I'm doing now, speaking to you with a camera here, it's something that took me about a decade or more to get used to and to build up that kind of resilience. So.
How do people react when you disclose the invisible part of your disability?
When you say the more invisible part, you mean my epilepsy?
For instance, yeah.
I've got epilepsy, and I didn't mention it earlier, I got severe asthma, which is a reason why I had to shield during the pandemic. People tend to be okay about that because they're more widely heard about, but again, reasonable adjustments tend not to get made. For example, if I were knocking on doors, canvassing, I ought to have somebody with me, but when I stood for election in 2018, there was nobody knocking on doors with me, leapfrogging door to door, and I did have seizures on my own, and I hit the ground, and I ended up with the bruises from that. So people need to factor these things in. The other hidden disabilities I have are the 3 worn vertebrae. So I've got chronic pain there. So as someone with epilepsy, I can't drive. And if I'm asked to knock on specific door numbers in the ward because I've been given a list, so campaign managers give you a list saying, can you knock on all of these by a certain date? And then if you can't drive to go road to road on your day off and you've got a finite amount of time, it can be pretty difficult. And also carrying literature and leaflets to deliver door to door when you've got 3 worn vertebrae is another strain on your back. If you've got a car boot that you can keep that in and pull up in one road and do the necessary numbers and drive to the next road, it's much easier. But not providing any support to do that I found very difficult, and I would have thought I would have had it because the party I was a member of was one that claims to be pro-equality of opportunity, but reasonable adjustments didn't come forth.
What would make your life easier?
Having support knocking on doors when you're part of a political party. I no longer am, I'm independent. Can't really expect that. I can build my own team gradually over time. But then, if we look at the workplace, for example, something that came out of the pandemic would be more reasonable adjustments for disabled people, being able to work remotely, having meetings online rather than in person, and all the things that employers for many years had said aren't possible, suddenly for many people became possible. For myself, I couldn't practically do my job from home, so my employer was very good and they paid us full pay while we were shielding, rather than furloughing us. But going back to the workplace and wanting a greater challenge, I expressed that I'd like to do a qualification that would transfer my career out of shop work and managing a shop to being at head office and doing things that are at a desk, which I could then do from home and remotely and stay with the business as well. So the government granted 3 years worth via employers of apprenticeships, and I was asking if I could do a SEMA as an apprenticeship. So that way I'd be earning money to keep paying my bills while I was retraining in a new skill for a new career. as yet that's not been forthcoming.
What does your average day look like?
An average day for me would be how do I get out of bed? Because when I wake up, I've got the most awful pain in my spine and other limbs. I feel really stiff, and it's so hard to get up when you've got chronic pain. I take my medication, let it kick in, and then I try getting up, and I'll go down the stairs and have a really fast breakfast, something that doesn't take any preparation. It's normally the old banana cereal bar and a cup of tea, and I take some supplements with that too that help with the symptoms of my conditions. I know what I'm taking because I sell them at work and I recommend them to people. And then I get the bus to work, so I have to walk to the bus stop, and I do my casework on the bus. I open my iPad provided by the council, and I'll respond to as many emails as I can before I get off the bus. I'll go on my social media and support people that I know who are either disabled themselves or otherwise politically active online, just with a few likes, retweets and shares. And then I go into my place of work. I say good morning to my manager. He says good morning to me, and I clock in. I put my stuff in the staff area at the back, and I start advising customers and getting on with the tasks. Some of the tasks are pretty strenuous and manual when it's stock administration and counting different stock items. That's a bit challenging when you've got 3 worn vertebrae, especially because where I work is an old style building. So our more modern branches have under plinth storage and overhead cupboards, so the stock can be in the right area for when you have to count it. But in our store, because it's so old, we don't have any of that. And our stock room, you can barely open the ladder out inside it. So we've got all of the vitamins in the middle, and we have to stand on a kickstool to get to them and lift up tray after tray stacked on top of each other to find things. Customers may place orders during the day, and if it's something we stock in store, then we have to find it. And if it's not on the shelf, that means fishing it out from the middle of the gondola by standing on a kickstool. And it could also be while you're alone trading, if somebody's on lunch or if they've gone home for the day. So that's again something else that I have to be careful with because of my epilepsy. So if we had a visit for environmental health and safety, they'd ask us, why is there a kickstool on the shop floor? A customer could trip on that. Something I'm sure you could appreciate yourself. And from my perspective, we need to keep it on our sales floor, but we try and keep it behind the till where customers are unlikely to trip on it, and take it out when we need to. Because that way, if I were to have a seizure, I've got something I can sit down on. So then after that, there's sometimes meetings after work. It could be a council meeting. It could be in person in York House, which is about 5 minutes walk from where I work. Or it could be online on Teams, it could be on Zoom, or it could be a meeting with another group or charity in the borough at a specific location. And I'll head there as soon as possible. Sometimes I'm able to get the bus home and then open my iPad and do the meeting from home. So that's pretty much my day. It'll be casework on the bus home, whether that's between work and a meeting or whether that's just on the way home because there's no meetings in the diary. And then when I get home, it'll be making sure I take my medication on time, eat in a timely manner, because if I don't, that can also trigger more seizures. And then check the iPad again in case there's some more last minute emails and more casework to do. And then a little bit of me time.
Do you think you have learned specific skills because of your disability?
Things that I've had to learn, I guess. Shopping little and often because of my 3 worn vertebrae. It means I don't have to carry a great big load of heavy shopping all at once. Then things like when I'm cooking, less time on the hob is really important. I have burned my face twice when I've had seizures cooking, and it's sensible to try and cook by other means, like using an oven and limited time with anything hot. Having a shower, I have to think about that. The hot water never on too hot, because too much steam can set off my asthma, which can set off my epilepsy. So that's another thing I have to adapt slightly. And I think lots of people with disabilities do make different adaptations and develop coping mechanisms. So they're just some things that I've done. So trying to think of other things. Computers, that's another one. So I've got different agendas, whether it's things to read for corporate parenting, the Safer Neighbourhood Board, or Epilepsy Action, who I'm a trustee of. And it could be council paperwork, like tonight I've got full council, and it's a long budget meeting, so a big pack to read. There's no way that around work, where I have to use a screen at work and do the admin before I close up, that I'm going to be spending all my time reading it on my council iPad on ModGov. So instead, what I do is ask for the paper copies, and I hate doing it because I'm quite environmentally friendly and it's a lot of waste of paper. But equally, I have to put my health first, and too much screen time can cause seizures. So using paper a bit more is one coping mechanism to limiting the number of seizures I have.
What was your experience of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Wow. When I first heard about it, there was a lot of panic buying. I remember customers were coming into where I work and they were just, have you got any aloe vera gel? I want to make my own hand sanitizer. Have you got hand sanitizers? Have you got face masks? Have you got anything for the immunity? And our immunity bay at work was almost empty. It was cleared out of vitamin C, zinc, you name it, propolis. Everyone was just buying everything they could to make themselves bulletproof to COVID-19. As news about the virus spreading to the UK was becoming more commonly known. And then I remember there was a conference that I was meant to go to in York, and I'd already paid for my travel and accommodation and couldn't get a refund. So I thought I'd go there anyway and have a bit of a holiday. And I remember getting there and I was going to meet a friend in the shambles, and then some driver and his friend came down a little narrow lane and tried to run me over. And I managed to get across the road safely without him running me over. But then he reversed and tried to hit me with the back of his vehicle. And the sudden shock of seeing him coming round to do that triggered a seizure. And I remember thinking I need to sit down somewhere quickly, and there was nowhere. I turned around and there was a couple walking towards me holding an umbrella and a bottle. And then the seizure started, and they caught me before I fell, but they also caught my eye. So I ended up with a fractured eye socket. I was called an ambulance by people who pulled me into a shop doorway or restaurant doorway, it might have been. And the ambulance asked if I wanted to go to hospital, but because I knew conference was cancelled due to the virus, I refused going to hospital because of my severe asthma. And I asked if they could take me back to the B&B where I was staying. So I went into the B&B via the back door so people didn't see that I was bleeding, and they'd given me a phone screen to use as a mirror in the ambulance, and I'd cleaned up some of the bleeding and blood from my face. I took it easy, washed my face properly in the sink, had a chamomile tea, and I remember I had to do some work on my phone. I had to put together a bio because I was applying to be a vice chair of an official political party body, and I had a deadline to meet, and the deadline was upon me. So I did that in bed and went to sleep, and when I woke up I couldn't open my eye, so I looked in the bathroom mirror and it was completely swollen, purple and white, and I had to just send photos to my manager and the regional manager and explain that this had happened, and when my holiday was over I wouldn't be back at work because I need to get it checked out properly at the GPs when I get back, if not a hospital. So I came back from that, I went to the GP surgery. My GP said I did the right thing not going to the hospital in York because of the pandemic, and not to go to the walk-in centre hospital around the corner either. He said he suspects it's a fractured eye socket, and all that they would do if they confirmed that with an X-ray is ask me to rest it for a couple of weeks. So he signed me off for 2 weeks, and I was stuck indoors on my own, already in isolation, before everybody was asked to stay in for lockdown and shielding. And from there I went straight into shielding. I remember my council iPad on my phone started buzzing at 6 in the morning, waking me up before I'd even woken up normally. and I was flat out signposting people until about midnight every day. I was also chairing meetings of trustees in this building and making sure that the food bank, which you may have seen when you arrived today, the food bank was functioning by people coming to the door and getting parcels at the door until the Trussell Trust decided that they would deliver that to people who use the food bank instead to save them coming out so they could stay safe. And we also had to make sure that the staff were getting money via furlough because we had to shut the centre, and busy doing other things because we'd just taken them on from another organisation, and we had to make sure everything was set up properly for the staff that they're best looked after. I also wanted to make sure that the other services were running, because things like Off the Record, which is counselling for young people, which runs from here, was able to still run, and people were still able to access services remotely if not here. And equally with Citizens Advice, who started seeing people remotely, because there's normally Citizens Advice running from here too. So I was pretty busy. So I'd say once my daily routine started, I was burning the candle at both ends, but I was having to do most of my casework and signposting of people online, and I was spending a lot more time than I'd have liked on my iPad. I was having to make sure I gave myself breaks from that because of my epilepsy, so I was making the most of my garden. Of course, it was the start of April at the time, and spring bulbs were up, the roses were starting to get little buds on them, so I was just going outside and making the most of the garden and taking some little photos of things. And I had a little bee nesting box, and I was watching the bees a lot because I thought there's something different and something exciting. And having just a little one-bedroom house to live in on my own, I had no pets or anyone there for sort of comfort and company. So watching the bees collecting mud and filling out all the holes in the nesting box was quite exciting. And then later on I was able to unscrew the underneath of the box and have a look at the little pupae inside, and it was just really incredible seeing what they were like before they turned into bees, and poking out from these sacs of pollen, and how the bees have managed to put all that pollen in there and wall it off effectively just by collecting tiny mud particles. It's just amazing how much they did and how quickly they did it. Probably being sat down for really long periods of time doing casework and helping people without having adequate seating at home for that. So I don't have a dining room, I'm in a small one-bed place, and so I had to do most of my work sat either on a creaky sofa in a darker room or in the garden with the rustling from the trees, which kept being interference for people when they were trying to hear me speak in meetings, or in my bed, and sitting on my bed with a really old mattress and the springs poking me ended up causing a nerve impingement, and I had shooting pains going from my hip all the way down towards my knee and back, and I had to take a load of painkillers, and I was prescribed some Voltarol gel with that as well.
What do you think was most challenging for the community you serve and for the disability community in general?
Most challenging? Wow. I think it would have been the isolation. I think lots of people were really isolated, not able to get essentials initially when the pandemic first started, and that's why the council set up, the borough, a community resilience hub near the council office and in the council offices. And people were bringing in food supplies, long life, non-perishable foods, and other items, sanitary products, etc. And councillors who were getting a DBS check done for them and other volunteers, which Richmond CVS, who's a local charity, got DBS checked, were also delivering things. And I think there was also some befriending services increasing as well to help tackle the isolation and loneliness that some people were facing. But the community really coming together was something I noticed that came out of that as a positive. So there were people that were still feeling isolated even just last week because they'd been staying safe at home for so long, even though the vaccines have been out. But at the time, people were really stressed because they didn't want to catch it. They didn't know if they would catch it easily, but they were reading all sorts of horror stories about people passing away. People's loved ones were going into hospital left, right and centre. The ambulances were everywhere, and a shortage of ambulances too. It didn't help that the hostile environment created by the government policy had cost us so many really valuable NHS workers, and as a result of that, our NHS was really stretched. There was daily updates from the council on YouTube, and in my council inbox too, as a councillor, I was getting updates from the local CCG, which is our clinical commissioning group. We'd hear the statistics as well on the rate of infection in the borough compared to the London average and the national average.
Is there anything we can learn from the pandemic about disability inclusion?
I think with that, it would be the remote working again and making things more accessible for more disabled people. I am aware that it wasn't suitable for everybody. For example, conferences went online as well, and some people found that conferences were less accessible for them, whereas other people who find travelling to get to conference really difficult because of their particular disabilities, they found that having a remote conference, which was a hybrid or just remote, was much easier for them. Jobs that allowed people to do their job from home, that just makes perfect sense. So many employers had previously said, sorry, but you can't work from home, or you won't be able to do this job, and maybe people had been discriminated against and not given the job, even though they were qualified for the job. And then all of a sudden employers didn't want to lose their staff, and so they did everything they can to get as many staff as possible, not on furlough, but working from home. And that's something that I think should stay, but my worry is that that's starting to now taper off and things are starting to return to as they were before.
What worries you about the future?
I worry that the future for disabled people isn't going to be what it could be, because people are going back to their old ways, and all those reasonable adjustments that came out because of people being able to work remotely and do jobs that they were told previously they couldn't do. And suddenly people are expected to travel again to workplaces when it's not necessary. So that is one concern.
Do you think the pandemic has changed the way people think about disability?
I think more people have been more inclusive to disabled people in the workplace during the pandemic, simply where so many other staff have been having to isolate and their workforce has been stretched. I don't know if it's gone far enough though. I think some people realise that disabled people are better at adapting because disabled people develop coping mechanisms to get around the barriers that they face depending on their specific disability. And people didn't realise that before. And where lots of people, when COVID happened, were suddenly facing all these barriers that they've never come across, disabled people were quicker to adapt than other people. But things like the supermarkets discriminating against disabled people, you know, that's one of those things where lessons had to be learned, I think. And supermarkets tried to do the right thing. They tried to say, well, if you're registered on the government website and you're registered with the NHS and we know you're susceptible and particularly extremely vulnerable group, then you'll be able to register with us to get home delivery. But then they weren't doing that and their phone numbers weren't working and people were just not able to register for a long time. And meanwhile, people who didn't need to have home delivery, who weren't clinically extremely vulnerable or susceptible to catching COVID-19, were booking up home delivery slots up until even July, some of the ones I saw. I was one of those people that was stuck at home for 2 weeks before I had to start shielding and found it really difficult to register to get food. And I'd been used to buying things little and often, so to suddenly need to buy a big amount of food and not being able to even book a delivery slot was difficult. But then they put the cost up of things, so my average weekly shop really increased. And then on top of that, I had a massive delivery charge. And to get the lesser delivery charges, I had to wait around for a driver late at night or be up ridiculously early in the morning, which would be too early for my epilepsy. And I don't think supermarkets appreciated that that's not possible for everybody, because not everybody's going to be in a family household with enough people that somebody would be up at all hours. But then, yeah, going back to adapting, I think with things like isolation, lots of disabled people were already used to having that isolation, doing things with little or no support on their own, the occasional carer, and they were able to adapt quicker and probably made them more resilient than other people who may have been more likely to take on the befriending services and things like that. I think lots of disabled people were more considerate of the needs of other people who were shielding and isolating. I'm not sure if I was personally prepared because of my disability any better than anybody else with a disability, because there are so many different disabilities. Being someone who lives independently with a disability probably put me in better stead than somebody who relies on someone attending to care for them. But that's simply because I didn't need somebody to visit me while I was shielding and during lockdown, whereas lots of people did. And also, because I'm more susceptible, it was a good thing that I didn't need to have somebody coming into my home, and I could just cope. I mean, I did need help with cleaning the house and things, but that just didn't happen. So.
Do you think people respond differently to your disability now?
I think it should have done. I think there are people who haven't responded to me with my disabilities in the way they should have done. So, for example, someone who, like myself, through being a counsellor, is automatically a corporate parent of the borough and should safeguard everyone who is susceptible or vulnerable, and didn't. So I reached out to somebody during lockdown in 2020, someone who I helped get elected, and rather than being supportive and empathetic and understanding, she actually lashed out for 2.5 hours, triggering my seizures and just making me feel so much worse. And I was really hurting from all the disability discrimination from supermarkets, and also because we just had the murder of George Floyd broadcast and all the Black Lives Matter riots. And I'd seen on social media that some police up north in Lancashire, I think it was, were caught on camera trying to set up ethnic minorities and saying it's my word against yours, and that was shared on social media. And it was just terrible that there was so much anger and hate and racism, and people were really, really hurting. And I was hurting, and I had nobody at home. And this individual and some of her friends had actually lashed out at me and literally weaponized a process accessible to them to try and eliminate me as a political competitor for certain seats. And that's really unacceptable. And I knew why they did it, because something called the the Alderdice Review had been published, and the Alderdice Review was published with the Thornhill Review, which is a mop-up of how the 2019 general election went in the summer of 2020. I'd given evidence to the Alderdice inquiry and helped it be set up, and I just knew that all the approved candidates who had received that in their email inbox and read it would realise that the playing field was going to be levelled for ethnic minorities, and that they would look around them to see who is an approved candidate from diverse groups who may have that level playing field at last. and that they would lose the privilege and advantage they've already got. And rather than accepting that that would be equality of opportunity, they sought ways to push out someone who is susceptible, vulnerable like myself, living alone without support at home. And I became targeted by a number of people. And that's also part of the reason why I'm independent now, because that doesn't align with their values or policies, and mine are true to the parties, whereas certain people clearly don't have them.
Do you think other parts of your identity impacted your experience of the pandemic?
It was hard, especially with all these events that happened. So the disability discrimination from supermarkets, the murder of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter riots, not being able to attend Pride every summer, you know, something that I've always done, and having the virtual events instead is just not the same as being there with your LGBTQIA brothers and sisters in a parade in London and celebrating properly.
What are your thoughts about the future?
I'm excited about the possibilities that we can do so much more remotely now. We can do so many different jobs we were told previously we couldn't do from home and online, and that opens up the workplace to more disabled people who can work, are able to work and want to work. And I just hope that that continues. Whether I get that opportunity is another matter, because my actual day job was something that I couldn't do from home. So I just had to stay safe at home, and fortunately I was paid on full pay for that. But I would like to get a job at head office and do that remotely with a new qualification. But whether I'll get the opportunity, we'll have to see, because I think, as I said earlier, employers are drifting away from what they found was possible during the pandemic.
If you could make any wish, what would you wish for?
Wow, if I could make a wish for myself. I wish that I can hold my seat as a councillor this May, because that way I can continue helping other people who need it the most. And this ward, as I said, I am the only councillor living in the ward that is a councillor for this ward. And local people here do need a lot of support. There's a lot of social housing, a lot of elderly people, a lot of disabled people. And it makes a big difference when you live in the area, because just walking about, people can approach you and tell you about their problems, or you can walk past things that need resolving. For example, I've reported a fridge freezer that's been dumped on a grass verge around the corner. Just the other day I called 999 for an ambulance for somebody because he was bleeding out. Ended up 2 hours late to work, but luckily people that I know were crossing the road with their dog and recognised me and realised I was phoning an ambulance, and they came over and help him. So.
What would you like non-disabled people to know?
There's probably a few things. I think people need to realise that not all disabilities are visible, and people need to be more aware of how they treat people with a disability and accept that they have a disability even when they can't see it, and ask if there are any reasonable adjustments that they need to make for them. I think people need to check their own conscious and unconscious bias when they're interacting with people with disabilities, because everyone does it, but the people who do it the most tend to be, in my experience, the people that don't realise they've got a problem and probably create the most macro and microaggressions towards disabled people and people with other protected characteristics. The third thing, treating disabled people with more respect and dignity, because historically that hasn't happened, and disabled people have been treated like second or third class citizens, and that has to change. And the slogan for International Women's Day this year, you know, we really need to break the bias.
What made you come forward for this documentary?
I remember reading an email from the National Association of Disabled Staff Networks where you reached out asking for people who are disabled and intersectional who have been working during the pandemic. And because I have returned to work during the pandemic in, well, not just one, but multiple roles, and I'm intersectional, I figured maybe I should come forward and share some experiences. Whether I've covered enough of those is another matter. So I hope it raises a lot more awareness about how disabled people have been treated in the past, how things changed for disabled people during the pandemic, how disabled people proved to be more resilient and quicker to adapt because of the coping mechanisms they have to do in their daily life to overcome the different barriers that people without their disability don't face, and how employers had to adapt for disabled people, especially with their workforces shrinking from people shielding and isolating and even passing away, and having to take time out for bereavement as well, where they've lost loved ones. So hopefully going forward, employers will take that on board and keep the different changes that they've made in that time in place.
Credits: Dr. Anica Zeyen, co-director, narrator and interviewer; Avril Coelho, interviewee; Wadeby, co-director. The British Academy funded this project. Copyright 2023, Dr. Anica Zeyen. All rights reserved.